The airplane cabin was calm. Passengers were settling into their seats, fastening their belts, placing bags in the overhead compartments. The soft hum of the engines vibrated through the floor as flight attendants moved down the aisle, smiling politely and checking tickets. For most people, it was just another ordinary flight. A businessman opened his laptop near the front. A mother helped her child buckle his seatbelt. 2 college students quietly laughed while scrolling through their phones. Nothing about the moment felt unusual. But near the middle of the plane, sitting quietly beside the window, was a man who seemed almost invisible to everyone around him. He wasn't talking. He wasn't looking around. He simply sat there calmly, hands resting on the armrest, his expression relaxed and peaceful. To the other passengers, he looked like any older traveler trying to enjoy a quiet flight. No one paid attention to him. No one noticed the quiet confidence in his posture, or the unusual calm in his eyes, and most importantly, no one realized who he really was, because the man sitting silently by that window was Steven Seagal.
Yes.
The martial arts legend known around the world for his calm presence, deadly precision, and ability to control a fight before it even begins. But today he wasn't wearing a suit from a movie set. He wasn't surrounded by cameras. He was just another passenger on a commercial flight, hoping for a peaceful trip. At least, that's how it seemed. 3 rows behind him, however, another passenger was already causing tension. A tall man with an aggressive attitude shoved his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment with unnecessary force. The loud thud made several passengers glance in his direction. He muttered angrily under his breath. Then he looked down the aisle. His eyes stopped on the quiet man sitting by the window. For a moment, nothing happened. But something in the man's expression suddenly changed. The calm atmosphere inside the airplane was about to disappear. Because within the next few minutes, that angry passenger was about to make the worst mistake of his life. He was about to pick a fight. With Steven Seagal, the angry passenger didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he stood in the aisle for a moment, scanning the rows of seats with a frustrated expression. His jaw was tight, and his shoulders moved with sharp, impatient motions as if the entire situation was already irritating him. Passengers nearby could feel the tension without even knowing why. He finally forced his way into his row, bumping into the armrests and muttering under his breath. The overhead compartment slammed shut above him with a loud bang that made a few people glance up. But even after sitting down, he didn't relax. He kept shifting in his seat. His leg bounced impatiently against the floor. Then suddenly he stood up again. This time, his eyes locked directly on the quiet man sitting by the window 3 rows ahead. Steven Seagal. The angry passenger stepped into the aisle and walked forward with heavy footsteps. Passengers watched him move down the narrow space between the seats. Something about his body language made it clear that he wasn't simply stretching his legs. He stopped right beside Steven's row. Steven remained calm, looking out the window at the runway lights in the distance. The passenger leaned over slightly. "You," he said sharply. Steven slowly turned his head.
Yes.
His voice was quiet and steady. The man pointed aggressively toward the armrest between the seats. "You're taking up too much space," he snapped. "Move over." Several nearby passengers exchanged confused looks. The seat clearly had enough room, and Steven wasn't doing anything unusual. But the angry man didn't seem interested in logic. Steven glanced down briefly and adjusted his position slightly. "There you go," Steven said calmly. "Plenty of room." For a brief moment, it looked like the situation might end there, but instead of calming down, the man's irritation only seemed to grow. He leaned closer, his voice becoming louder. "Don't play smart with me," he growled. Steven remained seated. His hands rested calmly on the armrests, and his expression didn't change. "I'm not," he replied quietly. Passengers nearby were now openly watching. Even a flight attendant standing a few rows away had begun observing the situation carefully. The tension in the cabin slowly thickened. The man crossed his arms and laughed sarcastically. "Look at you," he said loudly. "Acting tough like you're some kind of hero." Steven didn't respond. He simply looked back out the window again. That silence seemed to irritate the man even more.
"Hey,"
the passenger snapped suddenly. Steven turned his head again. The man leaned closer this time, his face only inches away. "You think ignoring me makes you brave?" Steven's eyes remained calm. "No," he said softly. "It just keeps things peaceful." A few passengers nearby quietly nodded, appreciating the attempt to avoid conflict. But the angry passenger clearly wasn't interested in peace. His face twisted with frustration. "Oh, I get it now," he mocked loudly. "You're one of those quiet, tough guys, huh?" Still, Steven didn't react. The calmness in his posture felt almost unnatural compared to the rising anger in the aisle. And that contrast was beginning to attract even more attention. People across several rows were now watching the scene unfold. Some passengers even lifted their phones slightly, sensing that something unusual was happening. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and already the tension inside the cabin was rising. But the most dangerous part of the situation was this. The angry passenger still had no idea who he was dealing with, and in just a few moments, his frustration was about to push him past a line he should never cross. For a few seconds, the airplane cabin stayed quiet. The angry passenger stood in the aisle, staring down at Steven as if waiting for a reaction. But Steven Seagal gave him none. He simply sat there calmly, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady, almost as if the tension around him didn't exist at all. And that silence only made the situation worse. The passenger scoffed loudly. "Wow," he said sarcastically. "You really think you're cool, don't you?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nobody liked what was happening. A middle-aged man sitting across the aisle quietly shook his head, hoping the argument would end before it got out of control. But the angry passenger wasn't finished. In fact, he seemed to be getting more irritated every second Steven refused to react. He leaned forward again, gripping the top of Steven's seat. "You hear me, old man?" he snapped. Steven slowly looked up. His expression remained calm, almost patient. "Yes," he replied softly. The passenger smirked. "Then maybe you should answer when someone talks to you." Steven studied the man for a brief moment, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet awareness of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "I already did," Steven said calmly. The man laughed loudly, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, really?" He turned slightly toward the surrounding passengers as if trying to draw attention. "Did you all hear that?" he mocked. "This guy thinks he's some kind of wise monk or something." A few passengers looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Others kept watching, unable to ignore the growing tension. Several rows back, someone slowly lifted their phone. Moments like this sometimes ended badly, and people had learned that when arguments happen in public, recording could matter. A flight attendant finally began walking toward the situation. Her steps were careful and professional. "Sir," she said gently to the angry passenger, "please return to your seat so we can prepare for departure." The man waved her off without even looking at her. "Relax," he said dismissively. "I'm just having a conversation." But his tone made it clear that it wasn't a conversation. It was intimidation. The flight attendant glanced briefly at Steven. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked politely. Steven gave a small nod. "Yes," he said calmly. His voice carried no frustration, no anger, just quiet composure. For a moment, the attendant hesitated. Then she slowly stepped back, hoping the situation might calm down on its own. But the angry passenger took her retreat as encouragement. He leaned even closer toward Steven. "You see that?" he sneered. "Even the staff knows you're the problem." Steven didn't respond. He simply looked at the man again, and that calm gaze seemed to irritate the passenger more than anything else. "You know what your problem is," the man said loudly. "You think you're better than everyone else." A few passengers exchanged glances. Anyone watching closely could see that Steven hadn't done a single aggressive thing since the argument started. Yet somehow the angry passenger had convinced himself that he was the victim. Steven spoke quietly. "I don't think that." The man scoffed again. "Oh, please." Then he leaned even closer, lowering his voice slightly. "But let me guess," he whispered sarcastically. "You're one of those guys who thinks he could beat anyone in a fight." Steven tilted his head slightly. For the first time, a faint hint of seriousness appeared in his eyes. "I don't look for fights," he said calmly. "But sometimes fights find people." The passenger rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh wow," he laughed. "Did everyone hear that? We've got a philosopher on board." Several passengers chuckled nervously, unsure how else to react. But underneath the laughter, the tension in the cabin continued building, because the angry passenger was getting closer, closer to Steven, closer to crossing a line, and everyone watching could feel it. The man suddenly slammed his hand down on the armrest beside Steven. The loud crack echoed through the cabin. Gasps came from a few nearby passengers. The passenger leaned down until his face was only inches away from Steven's. "Let's see how calm you stay now," he muttered. For a moment, the entire airplane seemed to freeze. Passengers stopped moving. Even the flight attendants paused. Everyone could sense that the situation had reached a dangerous point, because the angry passenger had just done something he couldn't take back. And within the next few seconds, he was about to push things even further. Further than he ever should have gone. Further than anyone on that plane expected. And the worst part, he still had absolutely no idea who the quiet man sitting in front of him really was. For a moment, the entire airplane felt frozen. The angry passenger's hand was still pressed hard against the armrest beside Steven Seagal. The loud impact had echoed through the narrow cabin, and now every passenger nearby was watching closely. Even people several rows away had leaned into the aisle to see what was happening. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the airplane engines and the faint rustling of passengers shifting nervously in their seats. The man slowly straightened his back. His expression had changed. What had started as irritation had now turned into something more aggressive, more reckless. "You see?" he said loudly, looking around at the nearby passengers. "No, everyone's paying attention." A few people quickly looked away, not wanting to be involved. But others kept watching, unable to ignore the growing tension. Steven Seagal remained seated. His hands still rested calmly on the armrests. His breathing was steady. His eyes stayed focused on the man standing in front of him. There was no anger there, no fear, just a quiet awareness, and that calmness seemed to frustrate the angry passenger more than anything else. He leaned closer again. "You really think you're tough, don't you?" he muttered. Steven didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the man carefully, studying him the way a chess player studies an opponent before making a move. Then he spoke softly. "You should sit down." The words were simple, calm, almost gentle, but they carried a strange weight that several nearby passengers immediately noticed. The man blinked in surprise. For a moment, he didn't seem to understand what he had just heard. Then he laughed, a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the aisle. "Sit down," he repeated. "You're telling me what to do now." Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't move, but he spoke again. "Yes." The man's smile slowly disappeared. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier. Even the flight attendants watching from a distance could feel the shift in the energy. The passenger leaned forward suddenly, placing both hands on the back of Steven's seat. "You know what your problem is," he said angrily. "You think you can talk to people like that and nothing will happen." Steven looked up at him. "I'm trying to stop something that doesn't need to happen," he replied calmly. But the man was no longer listening. His temper had already taken control. "Oh, I get it now," he sneered. "You're one of those guys who thinks he's smarter than everyone else." Steven shook his head slightly. "No." But the man cut him off before he could continue. "Don't talk," the passenger snapped suddenly. The sharp command made several passengers gasp quietly. No one had expected the argument to escalate this quickly. The man's voice grew louder. "Just sit there and listen." He pointed a finger directly at Steven's face. "You think you're calm right now. Let's see how calm you stay when someone pushes you." The words hung in the air like a warning. Several passengers now looked toward the flight attendants again, silently hoping someone would step in before things got worse. One attendant had already reached for the intercom near the front of the cabin. But before she could do anything, the angry passenger made his move. Without warning, he grabbed the front of Steven's shirt. The sudden movement caused several passengers to gasp loudly. A woman near the aisle covered her mouth in shock. Phones that had already been raised slightly were now fully lifted, recording everything. The man pulled Steven slightly forward by his collar. "Look at me when I talk to you," he demanded. For the first time since the argument began, Steven slowly stood up from his seat. The movement was calm, controlled, but it immediately changed the energy in the aisle, because now the two men were standing face to face. The passenger was slightly taller, but something about Steven's posture suddenly made the height difference feel meaningless. The angry man didn't notice. His grip on the shirt tightened. "You see," he said loudly to the surrounding passengers. Now he wants to stand up. But Steven didn't try to pull away. He simply looked at the man's hand gripping his shirt. Then he looked back at the man's eyes and spoke quietly. "You should let go." The words were calm, but this time, there was a clear warning in them. The passenger scoffed. "Oh yeah," he said. "Or what?" Several passengers held their breath. The tension had reached its highest point, because everyone could see it now. The argument had crossed the line from words to physical confrontation, and the man still didn't understand what kind of mistake he had just made. Steven remained completely still. His voice stayed calm. "I'm asking you one last time." The cabin had gone completely silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Every eye in the airplane was locked on the two men standing in the aisle, because something was about to happen. Something that the angry passenger clearly wasn't prepared for, and within the next few seconds, the cabin remained completely silent. Steven Seagal stood calmly in the narrow aisle, the angry passenger's hand still gripping the front of his shirt. Neither man moved. For a few seconds, it looked like time itself had slowed down. Passengers watched with wide eyes. A few phones continued recording quietly. Even the flight attendants had stopped walking, unsure if stepping in now might make things worse. Steven looked down briefly at the man's hand gripping his collar. Then he looked back into the man's eyes. His expression didn't change, still calm, still controlled. "Let go," Steven said quietly. The passenger laughed again, but this time the laugh sounded more forced. "Or what?" he repeated. Steven didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly reached up and placed his hand gently on the man's wrist. The movement was so calm, so controlled that several passengers leaned forward slightly to see what would happen next. Steven's voice remained soft. "I tried to stop this earlier," he said. The man rolled his eyes. "Oh, please." Steven continued speaking almost as if he wasn't bothered by the interruption. "Not for me," he added calmly, "but for you." The words hung strangely in the air. For a brief moment, even the angry passenger seemed confused. Then he burst into laughter again. "Listen to this guy," he said loudly, turning his head slightly toward the nearby passengers. "He's giving me life advice now." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Something about Steven's tone had felt different, not emotional, just certain. The passenger looked back at Steven. "You think I'm scared of you?" he asked mockingly. Steven shook his head slowly. "No." The answer seemed to catch the man off guard. "Then what?" he demanded. Steven studied him for a moment before replying. "I think you don't understand the situation." The passenger frowned. "What situation?" Steven's hand was still resting lightly on the man's wrist. But the strange thing was, even though the grip looked gentle, the passenger suddenly realized he couldn't pull his arm away. His smile faded slightly. He tried to move his wrist again. Nothing happened. Steven hadn't tightened his grip. He hadn't raised his voice. Yet somehow the passenger's arm felt locked in place. Passengers nearby began whispering quietly. Some of them had noticed it too. The man was trying to move his hand, and it wasn't working. "What the passenger muttered under his breath. Steven spoke calmly. "You should stop." The man glared at him. "You think you're strong," he snapped. Steven remained completely relaxed. "It's not about strength." The passenger pulled harder. His arm still wouldn't move. Now a few passengers were openly staring. Someone whispered from a nearby row. "How is he doing that?" The angry passenger's frustration began turning into confusion. Then anger again. "You're not funny," he said sharply. Steven didn't respond. Instead, he slightly adjusted his stance. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable. But suddenly the passenger's balance shifted slightly forward. His body leaned awkwardly, just a few inches, but enough to make him realize something was wrong. "What are you doing?" he snapped. Steven's voice stayed calm. "Trying to end this peacefully." The passenger scoffed again, though his voice now carried a hint of uncertainty. "You think you can scare me?" Steven shook his head. "No." Then he spoke a sentence that made several nearby passengers look at each other. "I'm trying to prevent you from embarrassing yourself." The man's face turned red. "Embarrass myself," he repeated angrily. He tried to pull his arm free one more time. This time he used his full strength, but his wrist still didn't move. The realization slowly crept across his face. Something about the situation was no longer under his control, and for the first time since the argument began, he looked uncertain. Passengers nearby were whispering more now. A young man sitting near the aisle leaned toward his friend. "Wait a second," he whispered. "I think I know who that is." His friend squinted toward Steven. "What do you mean?" The first man leaned closer. "Look at him carefully." Meanwhile, the angry passenger still hadn't figured it out. His pride wouldn't allow it. "You know what?" he said suddenly. "I've had enough of this." He raised his other hand slightly, as if preparing to push Steven away. Several passengers gasped quietly, because everyone could feel it. The moment was coming. The line had already been crossed, and now the angry passenger was about to make his final mistake. But what he still didn't realize was that the calm man standing in front of him wasn't just another passenger. He was a martial arts master, a man who had spent decades training his body and mind to control exactly this kind of situation. And within the next few seconds, the entire airplane was about to witness something they would never forget. The angry passenger raised his other hand. For a brief moment, it looked like he was about to shove Steven backward. Several passengers gasped quietly. Phones were now fully raised. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but Steven Seagal still didn't move. His hand remained lightly resting on the man's wrist. Steady, controlled, the passenger pushed forward slightly, and that was the moment everything changed. In a movement so fast that many passengers barely saw it, Steven rotated his wrist, not violently, not dramatically, just a smooth, precise motion. Suddenly the passenger's arm twisted outward, his balance shifted, and before anyone fully understood what had happened, the man dropped to one knee in the aisle. A sharp gasp spread through the cabin. The entire movement had taken less than 2 seconds. No punches, no shouting, just control. The angry passenger's face twisted with shock. What are you doing?" he shouted. Steven's voice remained calm. "I asked you to let go." The man tried to stand, but as he pushed upward, the pressure on his wrist increased slightly. His body instantly dropped back down. Passengers stared in disbelief. Some of them hadn't even seen the move clearly. All they knew was that the aggressive man who had been yelling moments ago was now kneeling helplessly in the aisle. "How is he doing that?" someone whispered from the back rows. Other passenger leaned toward his friend. "Wait," he said quietly. "I recognize him." His friend frowned. "Recognize who?" The first man pointed subtly toward Steven. "That's Steven Seagal." The word spread quickly in whispers. "Steven Seagal. No way. Is it really him?" Several passengers leaned into the aisle to look closer. The realization slowly moved through the cabin like electricity. The quiet man sitting peacefully by the window, the man who had tried to avoid the entire conflict, was actually a world-famous martial artist. Meanwhile, the angry passenger still hadn't processed what was happening. "Let go of me," he snapped. Steven looked down at him. His expression remained completely calm. "I will," Steven said quietly. "But only when you stop trying to fight." The man clenched his jaw. His pride was clearly battling with the reality of the situation. "You think you're tough," he muttered. Steven shook his head. "This isn't about being tough." Then he slightly adjusted the position of the man's wrist again. The pressure instantly increased. The passenger winced. A few passengers gasped again. Steven leaned slightly closer and spoke softly. "If I wanted to hurt you," he said calmly, "this conversation would already be over." The words were not threatening. They were simply factual. The man froze. For the first time since the argument began, he realized he was completely overpowered, and Steven hadn't even used full strength. A long moment passed. Then the passenger finally spoke again. His voice was much quieter now. "Okay." Steven studied his face. "Okay, what?" The man looked down at the floor. "Okay, I'm done." The tension in the cabin eased slightly. Steven slowly released the pressure on the man's wrist. Then he stepped back. The passenger quickly pulled his arm close to his chest and stood up. He looked around the cabin. Dozens of passengers were watching him. Some were still holding their phones. The man's face flushed red with embarrassment. He avoided Steven's eyes. For a moment, it seemed like he might start arguing again. But then he simply turned around. Without another word, he walked back toward his seat. The cabin remained quiet. No one laughed. No one cheered. They were simply stunned. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't a fight. It was something far more impressive: control. Absolute control. Steven calmly adjusted his shirt collar and returned to his seat by the window. Just like that. The tension that had filled the cabin minutes earlier slowly faded away. Passengers continued whispering quietly to each other.
"Did you see that?"
That was incredible. He didn't even hit him. Meanwhile, Steven simply looked out the window again, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the lesson of the moment was already clear to everyone on that plane. Respect should never depend on knowing who someone is, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should underestimate the least. For several seconds after the confrontation ended, the airplane cabin remained unusually quiet. Passengers were still processing what they had just seen. Only a few minutes earlier, the angry passenger had been shouting loudly, trying to intimidate the quiet man sitting by the window. Now that same man sat silently in his seat again, staring out at the runway lights beyond the glass. Steven Seagal looked exactly the same as he had before the argument started. Calm, relaxed, almost invisible again. The difference was that now everyone on the plane knew who he was. Whispers quietly moved through the cabin. That was Steven Seagal. "I can't believe it. Did you see how fast that happened?" Some passengers replayed the moment on their phones. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. Because what had happened wasn't just impressive, it was controlled. There had been no anger, no shouting, no attempt to humiliate the man who had started the argument. Steven had simply stopped the situation before it turned into something worse. A flight attendant slowly walked down the aisle toward Steven's seat. Her expression was polite but curious. "Sir," she said quietly, "is everything all right now?" Steven nodded. "Yes," he replied calmly. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Well, thank you for handling that situation peacefully." Steven gave a small nod in return. The attendant walked back toward the front of the cabin, clearly relieved that things had not escalated further. Meanwhile, the angry passenger sat silently in his seat several rows back. He avoided looking toward Steven. The confidence he had shown earlier had completely disappeared. Now he simply stared down at his hands. The reality of what had happened was slowly settling in. He had tried to start a fight with someone he thought was weak. Someone he thought he could intimidate. But instead, he had exposed his own behavior in front of an entire airplane full of people. And the man he tried to provoke hadn't even needed to throw a single punch. Several minutes later, as the plane prepared for departure, the captain's voice came through the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be taxiing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Passengers settled back into their seats. The tension that had filled the cabin earlier had finally disappeared. The airplane slowly began moving toward the runway. Steven glanced briefly down the aisle. For a moment, his eyes met the angry passengers. The man quickly looked away, but Steven didn't show anger. Instead, he spoke calmly across the quiet cabin. "Everyone makes mistakes." Several nearby passengers looked up. The man hesitated before looking back. Steven continued, "What matters is learning from them." The passenger didn't answer, but his shoulders lowered slightly. The message had been understood. Steven then leaned back in his seat again and looked out the window. The airplane engines grew louder as the plane accelerated down the runway. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Passengers returned to their conversations, their phones, or simply stared out the windows at the clouds passing below. But one lesson from that flight would stay in their memories for a long time. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is also the strongest, not because they want to prove it, but because they know they don't need to. And maybe that's the real lesson from what happened on that airplane. Respect should never depend on knowing who someone is. Respect should be given to everyone, because you never truly know the story of the person sitting next to you. If you believe respect should be given to everyone, no matter who they are, comment RESPT and tell us in the comments. What country are you watching from? He was about to discover exactly who he had just grabbed.